The lights hit her like a spotlight made of fire. Clara Morelli stood in the center of the Silver Monarch's marble floor, heart hammering so loud she thought the whole restaurant could hear it. 200 eyes locked onto her. The chandeliers overhead turned her cheap black uniform into something that glowed under all that gold light. Her hands were shaking. Her breath came short and shallow. And there he was, Luciano Vero, the man whose name made grown men whisper. The Mafia boss who owned half of Manhattan's underground and controlled the rest with a single phone call. He sat at his table like a king on a throne, surrounded by men in expensive suits and women dripping in diamonds. His dark eyes were fixed on her, not with desire, not with pity, with amusement, the kind of look you give a mouse right before you let your cat play with it. She could still hear his voice echoing in her head from 60 seconds ago. That cold, smooth voice that had dared her to dance, that had turned her humiliation into entertainment for the most dangerous man in New York City. The whole table had laughed. The whole restaurant had gone silent. And somewhere between the shame burning her cheeks and the knot twisting in her stomach, something inside Clara Morelli had snapped. Or maybe it had finally woken up. The violin started, soft at first. Then the piano joined in. Someone had actually queued up music. This wasn't a joke anymore. This was real. She was standing in the middle of a five-star restaurant about to either dance or die of embarrassment. Every server she worked with was frozen against the walls. Every guest had turned in their seats. Would you have the courage to do what Clara did? Tell me in the comments, and don't forget to hit that like button for her bravery. Clara closed her eyes for just 1 second. In that darkness, she made a choice. She'd spent 26 years being invisible. 26 years keeping her head down, her voice quiet, her dreams buried under rent payments and double shifts. 26 years letting people like Luciano Vero decide what she was worth. Hi viewers, kindly tell us where you're watching from and what time it is. Warm welcome to the family. Enjoy the story. When her eyes opened again, they weren't the same. Her right foot moved first, a step so deliberate it made the marble sing. Then her left. The music swelled and Clara began to dance. Not the shy shuffle of a waitress trying to survive. Not some awkward attempt to get through a nightmare. She danced like she was made of lightning and silk. Like the floor belonged to her. Like she'd been born doing this. Because she had been. Every turn was sharp. Every movement told a story. Her arms painted pictures in the air. Her body remembered what her mind had tried to forget. The restaurant disappeared. The people disappeared. Even Luciano Vero disappeared. There was only the music and the truth her body had kept hidden for so long. She'd been a dancer once, before life broke her family, before the world taught her that dreaming was dangerous. The tempo built. Her feet moved faster. The fabric of her uniform twisted and flowed like it was expensive silk instead of polyester. 60 seconds. That's all it took. 60 seconds to show everyone in that room that the quiet ones, the invisible ones, the ones you think you can crush, sometimes are just waiting for the right moment to remind you who they really are. The final note hung in the air. Clara stopped. Center stage. Chest rising and falling. Not from exhaustion. From freedom. The silence that followed was so thick you could drown in it. She didn't bow. She didn't smile. She didn't apologize. She just looked him dead in the eye. Luciano Vero, the man who thought he could buy anything, control anyone, and she said 5 words that would haunt him forever. But let's rewind. 6 hours earlier, Clara Morelli was nobody. Just another face in a city of 8 million faces. Just another waitress in a uniform that never quite fit right. Just another girl trying to survive in a world that didn't care if she made it or not. Her alarm went off at 3 in the afternoon. The sound pulled her out of dreams that were always the same. Dancing. Always dancing. In those dreams, her feet never hurt. Her body never ached. And her father was still alive, standing in the corner of the studio, clapping to keep the rhythm. She opened her eyes to her studio apartment in Queens. 400 square feet of reality. Peeling paint. A window that looked out at a brick wall. A mattress on the floor because she'd sold her bed frame 3 months ago to cover the electric bill. This was her life. Small. Quiet. Safe. Claire stood in front of the bathroom mirror and practiced her smile. The one she'd wear for the next 8 hours. The one that said, "I'm fine. Thank you for asking," even though nobody ever asked. She tied her dark hair back, so tight it made her scalp ache. Invisible. That's what she needed to be. The best servers were the ones customers never remembered. If you've ever been underestimated, this chapter is for you. Like if you've ever been in Clara's shoes. The subway ride to Manhattan took 40 minutes. She stood pressed between strangers, holding the rail, watching her reflection in the dark window. Sometimes she'd catch herself moving, just slightly. Her hips would sway to music only she could hear. Her shoulders would roll. Her feet would shift into positions she'd learned when she was 7 years old. Then she'd stop, force herself still, because dancers needed studios and lessons and time. Clara had none of those things. She had rent. She had bills. She had the ghost of a family business that had crumbled to dust 5 years ago, taking her father's heart with it. The Silver Monarch rose up on Fifth Avenue, like a temple made of glass and gold. Clara had worked there for 2 years. Long enough to know which guests tipped well and which ones snapped their fingers like she was a dog. Long enough to memorize every table, every wine, every way to disappear into the background while still doing her job perfectly. She clocked in at 4:30, changed into her uniform. Black pants, white shirt, black vest. The fabric smelled like industrial detergent and other people's perfume. In the locker room mirror, she looked exactly like what she was. Forgettable. Table 12 tonight, her manager said without looking up from his clipboard. Private party. Big spenders. Don't mess it up. Clara nodded. She never messed up. That was her superpower. Being so careful, so precise, so invisible that nothing ever went wrong. She'd learned that lesson young. The world didn't forgive mistakes. Not for people like her. The evening shift started slow. Appetizers. Wine. The usual rhythm of plates and glasses and quiet footsteps. Clara moved through the restaurant like a shadow. Present but not really there. She'd perfected the art of existing without taking up space. At 7:15, the front doors opened. The temperature in the room changed. You could feel it, like when a storm is coming and the air gets heavy and your skin prickles with electricity. Every server stopped moving. Every guest looked up. Even the kitchen went quiet. Clara felt it before she saw him. But that night, fate decided her invisibility had gone on long enough. The first thing you noticed was the silence. Not the absence of sound, but the way sound changed when Luciano Vera walked into a room. Conversations dropped to whispers. Silverware stopped clinking. Even the music from the pianist in the corner seemed to soften, like it knew better than to compete for attention. Then came the footsteps. Heavy, deliberate. The kind of footsteps that said, "I own this floor and I know it." Black leather shoes that probably cost more than Clara made in 6 months. Custom-tailored suit so dark it looked like liquid night. 3 men walked behind him. Bodyguards. You could tell by the way their eyes swept the room, cataloging exits, counting threats, calculating distances. But Luciano Vero didn't need to look around. He already knew he was the most dangerous thing in the building. Would you dare serve someone like Luciano? Comment below how you'd react. Clara watched from behind the server station. Her hands gripped the edge of the counter. The manager rushed forward, practically bowing. Luciano didn't acknowledge him. Just walked straight to table 12. The best table in the house. Corner position. View of the entire restaurant. Back to the wall. Exactly where a man like him would want to sit. He was maybe 40. Dark hair starting to gray at the temples. Face that would have been handsome if it wasn't so cold. The kind of cold that came from seeing too much. Doing too much. Being the person everyone else was afraid to become. His eyes were the worst part. Dark and empty and calculating. Like he could see straight through you to whatever weakness you were trying to hide. The rest of his party arrived. 5 more men. 2 women. All of them dressed like they'd raided a jewelry store on the way over. Diamonds. Gold. Watches that could feed a family for a year. They laughed too loud. Drank too fast. Spoke in Italian sometimes, English others, switching back and forth like a code. Clara's manager appeared at her elbow. His face was pale. Sweaty. "That's your table," he whispered. "I know. Don't screw this up. That's Luciano Vero. Do you understand what that means?" Clara understood. Everyone in New York understood. Luciano Vero was the kind of name that showed up in newspapers with words like alleged and suspected and under investigation. The kind of name that made prosecutors nervous and witnesses disappear. The kind of power that existed in shadows and backrooms, and places the law couldn't quite reach. He owned construction companies, shipping businesses, nightclubs, restaurants. At least, that's what the paperwork said. What everyone knew but couldn't prove was that he owned so much more. Protection rackets, gambling operations, the docks, half the police force, if the rumors were true. Clara picked up her notepad. Her hands were steady. They had to be. She'd learned a long time ago how to hide fear, how to smile when you wanted to scream, how to serve people who looked at you like you weren't quite human. She walked to table 12. The conversation stopped when she approached. 8 pairs of eyes turned to her. Luciano Vero leaned back in his chair, one arm draped over the back, the other holding a glass of whiskey he hadn't ordered yet. Someone had already brought it to him. That's the kind of power he had. People anticipated his needs before he spoke them. "Good evening," Clara said. Her voice was quiet but clear. Professional. Practiced. "Welcome to the Silver Monarch. Can I start you with?" "You're new," one of the younger men interrupted. He had slicked back hair and a smile that made Clara's skin crawl. "I've worked here 2 years, sir. Never seen you before." He looked her up and down like she was an item on the menu. "You always this quiet?" Clara's jaw tightened. "Can I get you something to drink?" She had no idea that the man she was about to serve was the same one who'd taken everything from her family years ago. The young man with the slick-back hair laughed. It was the kind of laugh that had cruelty baked into it. The kind that said he'd never been told no in his entire life. "She's shy," he said to the table. "Look at her. Can barely make eye contact." The others chuckled. Not Luciano. He just watched. Silent. Those dark eyes studying Clara like she was a puzzle he was trying to solve, or a bug he was deciding whether to crush. Clara kept her face neutral. This wasn't the first time guests had mocked her. Wouldn't be the last. She'd learned to let it slide off, to be water instead of stone. Water didn't break. It just moved around obstacles and kept flowing. "I'll give you a moment to decide," she said, turning to leave. "Wait." The young man's voice sharpened. "I'm not done with you." Clara stopped, turned back. Her smile stayed in place. Perfect. Professional. Empty. "What's your name?" "Clara, sir." "Clara." He said it like he was tasting something spoiled. "You know what I think, Clara? I think you're scared. I think you walk around this place like a little mouse, hoping nobody notices you. Am I right?" The table laughed again. Clara's fingers tightened around her notepad. Under the surface, something was stirring. Something she kept locked down for 5 years. Since the night her father's dance studio went bankrupt. Since the night the investors pulled out and the bank foreclosed and her father sat in the empty building crying like a child. If you love seeing arrogance challenged, give this video a thumbs up right now, because things are about to get intense. "I'm just here to take your order, sir." Boring. The young man leaned back, mimicking Luciano's posture, trying to impress him. "You know what would be interesting? If little Clara here showed us she's not completely dead inside. Can you dance, Clara?" The question hit her like a slap. "Excuse me? Dance? You know, move your body. Have fun. Or are you too shy for that too?" The air at the table changed. The women looked uncomfortable. One of the older men cleared his throat. But nobody told the young man to stop. That's how it worked with men like this. They tested boundaries, pushed limits, and everyone else just watched to see what would happen. Then Luciano Vero spoke for the first time. His voice was smooth, quiet, the kind of quiet that was more dangerous than shouting. "Leave her alone, Marco." "Marco." The young man's smile faltered. "I'm just having fun. You're being tedious." Luciano took a sip of his whiskey. "Though I admit, I'm curious now. Can you dance, Clara?" The question sounded different coming from him. Not mocking, just genuinely curious. Like he noticed something about the way she moved and wanted to know if he was right. Clara's throat went dry. "I'm here to serve, not entertain. Everything's entertainment if you look at it the right way." Luciano set down his glass. The motion was so controlled it was almost hypnotic. "How about this? If you're brave enough to dance for us, right here, right now, I'll tip you enough to quit this job. $5,000. The table went silent. $5,000. That was 3 months' rent. That was her father's medical bills from before he died. That was the difference between surviving and actually living. But it was also humiliation. It was being their circus animal, their joke, their entertainment. Clara felt something crack inside her chest. Not break. Crack. Like ice right before it shatters. Marco grinned. She won't do it. Look at her. She's terrified. The restaurant had gone quiet. Other tables were watching now. Whispers spreading like wildfire. The shy waitress. The Mafia boss. The dare. Clara's hands stopped shaking. She looked at Luciano Vero. Really looked at him. And in that moment, she made a choice that would change everything. She set the notepad down on the table. Carefully. Deliberately. Would you like me to dance now, sir? The music started before anyone could answer. Someone, a server Clara would never identify, had rushed to the pianist and whispered something. The old man at the keys looked confused, then intrigued, then he nodded and his fingers found a melody. Something slow at first. Classical. The kind of music that belonged in concert halls and opera houses, not restaurants where mobsters made bets about shy waitresses. Clara stepped back from the table. The space between the tables wasn't much. Maybe 10 feet of marble floor. But it might as well have been a stage at Lincoln Center. Every eye in the Silver Monarch was on her. Guests had stopped eating. Servers pressed against the walls. Even the kitchen staff had crowded into the doorway to watch. Her heart was pounding, but not from fear anymore, from something else entirely. She closed her eyes, took one breath, then another, and when she opened them again, Clara Morelli, the invisible waitress, was gone. In her place stood someone else, someone who'd been buried under years of shame and survival and settling for less. Her first step was a whisper. If this scene gave you chills, drop a dancing emoji in the comments. Let's show Clara some love. The second was a declaration. By the third, the entire restaurant understood they were watching something that didn't belong in their world. Something too pure, too powerful, too real. Clara didn't just dance. She told a story with her body. Every movement was a word. Every turn was a sentence. Her arms swept through the air like she was painting invisible pictures. Her feet knew exactly where to land, how to slide, when to pause. The cheap uniform that had made her invisible now clung to her body, outlining every muscle, every curve, every line of strength she'd been hiding. The music built. The pianist was improvising now, following her lead instead of the other way around. Faster, more complex. The melody twisted and climbed, and Clara matched it perfectly. She spun, and her hair came loose from its tight bun, falling around her shoulders like dark water. She leaped, and for a moment, just a moment, she wasn't bound by gravity or reality or any of the rules that said girls like her didn't get to fly. At table 12, Marco's smile had died. The women were leaning forward, hands over their mouths. The older men looked uncomfortable, like they'd expected a joke and gotten a sermon instead. And Luciano Vero sat perfectly still, his glass forgotten, his eyes locked on Clara with an intensity that would have terrified her an hour ago. But now she didn't care. Let him watch. Let them all watch. This was hers. This moment. This truth. Nobody could take it from her. Her father had taught her to dance when she was 5 years old, in the studio that bore their family name. Morelli Dance Studio. 3 rooms on the Lower East Side with mirrors on every wall and wooden floors worn smooth by decades of feet. He taught her that dancing wasn't about technique. It was about honesty, about saying the things you couldn't put into words. Right now, Clara was saying everything. I'm not afraid of you. I'm not small. I'm not nothing. The music reached its peak. Clara's final spin brought her to the exact center of the floor. Her arms extended, her head tilted back, her chest heaving with exertion and exhilaration and something that felt dangerously close to joy. The last note hung in the air, then silence. Clara lowered her arms slowly. She didn't bow. She didn't curtsy. She didn't smile or apologize or try to make what just happened smaller, so everyone else could feel more comfortable. She just looked at Luciano Vero, and when the music stopped, she didn't bow. She walked away, but the look in his eyes said the game had just begun. The first sound was a single clap. Slow, deliberate, It echoed through the silver monarch like a gunshot. Luciano Vero brought his hands together again. Then again, the sound cut through the stunned silence, and suddenly the entire restaurant erupted. Applause thundered from every corner. Guests rose from their tables. Servers rushed forward, their professional masks cracking into genuine smiles. Even the kitchen staff were cheering, banging wooden spoons against pots in a rhythm that matched Clara's still racing heartbeat. But Clara only heard white noise. She stood there, chest heaving, reality crashing back in her body like cold water. What had she just done? She danced. In front of everyone. In front of him. The invisible girl had made herself impossible to ignore, and there was no taking it back now. Her manager appeared at her side, his face a mixture of shock and something that might have been respect. Clara, that was... She didn't wait for him to finish. Her legs carried her toward the back, toward the kitchen, toward anywhere that wasn't the center of 200 staring eyes. But she made it only 3 steps before Luciano's voice stopped her. Wait, just that one word, spoken quietly, but everyone heard it. Ever seen pride melt into respect? A bit like if you believe dignity wins over arrogance every time. Clara turned slowly. Luciano was standing now. The whole table was standing. He reached into his jacket, pulled out a leather wallet, and removed a stack of bills. He didn't count them, just set them on the table. 5,000, he said. As promised. Clara stared at the money. It sat there like a test, like a trap. She could take it, walk out, never come back. That had been the deal. But something in her had shifted. The part of her that used to need things, that used to bend and compromise and shrink herself down, that part was gone. Burned away in 60 seconds of defiance. Keep it, she said. The restaurant went silent again. You could have heard a pin drop in the kitchen 3 rooms away. Luciano's eyebrow raised. Just slightly. You don't want the money? I didn't dance for money. Clara's voice was steady now. Strong. I danced because you thought I couldn't. You thought I was too scared. Too small. You were wrong. For the first time since he'd walked into the restaurant, Luciano Vero looked genuinely surprised. Not angry. Not amused. Just caught off guard by someone who'd refused to play the game the way he expected. Marco tried to laugh it off. She's crazy. Who turns down 5 grand? But Luciano raised a hand, and Marco went silent. The Mafia boss studied Clara like he was seeing her for the first time. Really seeing her. Not as a waitress or entertainment or something to own, but as an equal. As someone who'd just taught him a lesson he didn't know he needed. What's your last name? He asked. Morelli. Something flickered across his face. Recognition? Confusion? It happened too fast to read. Morelli, he repeated, like he was tasting the word, testing it against some memory he couldn't quite place. Clara nodded once, then turned and walked away. This time, nobody stopped her. She made it to the locker room before her legs gave out. She sat on the bench, hands shaking again, but not from fear. From adrenaline. From the realization that she'd just stared down one of the most dangerous men in New York and hadn't blinked. Outside, the restaurant slowly returned to normal. Conversations resumed. Orders were placed. But nothing was the same. Every server who passed Clara gave her a look of newfound respect. Guests whispered and pointed. She'd become someone in the span of a single dance. An hour later, Table 12 paid their bill and left. Clara watched from the kitchen window as Luciano and his entourage walked to their black cars. But before he got in, he paused, turned, looked back at the restaurant like he was trying to memorize something. Then he was gone. Clara finished her shift in a daze. When she finally clocked out at midnight, her manager pulled her aside. That was the bravest or stupidest thing I've ever seen, he said. I can't decide which. Me neither, Clara admitted. She walked to the subway, rode home to Queens, and collapsed on her mattress, still wearing her uniform. Sleep came fast, but dreams came faster. She was dancing again. But this time, when she spun around, her father was there in the corner of the studio, and he was smiling. 3 days passed. Clara returned to work, expecting everything to go back to normal. Expected the moment to fade like all moments do. But on her locker, someone had left a white rose and a note. 3 words in handwriting she didn't recognize. Keep dancing, Clara. The rose sat on Clara's kitchen counter for a week. She'd bring it home, put in a glass of water, and stare at it like it might suddenly explain itself. Who leaves anonymous roses? Who writes notes that feel like promises and threats at the same time? She told herself it was probably another server. Maybe a guest who'd been moved by her dance. Nothing sinister, nothing complicated, but she knew. Somewhere deep in her gut, she knew. On the 8th day after the dance, Luciano Vero walked into the Silver Monarch alone. No bodyguards, no entourage, no table full of laughing criminals in expensive suits. Just him, at 7 in the evening, when the restaurant was nearly empty. He wore different clothes. Still expensive, but quieter. A dark sweater. Slacks. Almost like he was trying not to be noticed, which was impossible for a man like him. Clara was refilling salt shakers when she looked up and saw him standing in the entrance. Their eyes met across the room. He didn't smile, didn't wave, just looked at her with an expression she couldn't read. Her manager rushed over to him, but Luciano waved him off. He walked straight to the bar, ordered a whiskey, and sat down on a stool like he had all the time in the world. Do you believe people like Luciano can truly change? Comment yes or no. I'm curious what you think. Clara finished with the salt shakers. Told herself to stay in the back. This wasn't her problem. He probably wasn't even here for her. But her feet had other ideas. They carried her to the bar before her brain could stop them. Can I get you anything else? She asked. Luciano looked at her. Up close, without the crowd and the performance, he looked different. Older, tired. Like the weight of whatever he carried was finally starting to show. Sit down, he said. I'm working. The restaurant is empty. Seats. It wasn't a request, but it wasn't quite a command either. Clara glanced at her manager, who nodded nervously from across the room. She slid onto the stool next to Luciano, keeping one seat between them. They sat in silence for a full minute. Luciano drank his whiskey. Clara folded her hands in her lap. The bartender polished glasses and pretended not to listen. You left a rose on my locker, Clara said finally. I did. Why? Because you deserved more than applause. He set down his glass. What you did that night. Most people spend their whole lives being too scared to do. You reminded me of something I'd forgotten. What? That courage doesn't need permission. Clara studied his profile. This close, she could see the scars. Small ones. On his knuckles. Near his ear. The kind you got from a life that wasn't lived behind desks and lawyers. You want to know why I didn't take your money? She asked. I have theories. It's because I used to have something money couldn't buy. And people like you took it from me. Luciano turned to face her fully now. Explain. Clara took a breath. This was dangerous territory. You didn't accuse men like Luciano Vero of things. You didn't poke at their guilt or their past. But she'd already crossed the line. Might as well see where it led. Morelli Dance Studio, she said. Lower East Side. It was my father's. Been in our family for 40 years. 3 years ago, the building got bought out. New developers. Big construction company. They tripled the rent overnight. We couldn't pay. Lost everything. My father died 6 months later. Heart attack. But it wasn't his heart. It was his spirit. She watched his face carefully. Watched the way his jaw tightened. The way his hand gripped the glass just a little harder. Vero Construction, she continued. That was the company. I looked it up after you told me your name. After I went home and couldn't sleep. Your company bought that building. Your company destroyed my father's dream. So no, I didn't want your money. Because all the money in the world won't bring him back. The silence that followed felt like drowning. Luciano stared at his whiskey. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Morelli Dance Studio. On Delancey Street. You remember. I remember all of them. He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw something that might have been pain. Every business, every family, every dream I crushed to build my empire. I remember because forgetting would be too easy. He froze as she said the name, and the truth hit him like a bullet. Luciano didn't come back to the restaurant for 3 weeks. But things started changing anyway. First, it was small. A regular at table 7, a businessman who always complained, suddenly started tipping better. Then the hostile couple at table 3 stopped snapping their fingers at servers. Little shifts, tiny cracks in the usual cruelty that defined the Silver Monarch's wealthier clientele. Clara noticed, but didn't understand. Not until the other servers started talking. "Did you hear?" Maria whispered during a cigarette break behind the kitchen. "Vincent Caruso came in last week. You know, the guy who threw a plate at Ginny last month? He apologized. Actually apologized. Left a $200 tip." "Caruso doesn't apologize to anyone," another server said. "He does now. Word is someone had a conversation with him. Someone who suggested he learn some manners." Clara felt a chill run down her spine. If you believe in redemption, share this story. Someone needs this message today. The changes weren't just happening at the restaurant. Clara heard things, saw things. A woman who used to beg outside the subway station near her apartment suddenly wasn't there anymore. Clara asked around and learned someone had paid for her to get into a shelter program. Anonymous donation, big enough to cover 6 months. The community center 3 blocks from her apartment, the one that was about to close due to lack of funding, suddenly received a grant. No name attached, just enough money to keep the doors open for another year. And then there was the biggest change of all. Clara was walking home from work one night, exhausted from a double shift, when she passed Delancey Street. She'd avoided that block for 3 years. Too many memories, too much pain. But tonight, something made her turn down it. The building was still there, the one that used to house Morelli Dance Studio. But something was different. There were construction crews outside, not tearing it down, building it up. New windows, fresh paint, a sign covered in canvas, waiting to be revealed. Clara stood across the street, heart pounding. A worker noticed her staring. "You lost, miss. What's being built here?" "Dance studio. Some rich guy bought the whole building. Renovating it. Supposed to open next month. Free classes for kids in the neighborhood." The worker shrugged. "Nice change. Usually, these places turn into overpriced condos." Clara's hands were shaking. She walked closer, peered through the window. Inside, she could see wooden floors being refinished, mirrors being installed. The exact layout her father had designed 40 years ago being brought back to life. On the door, taped to the inside, was a piece of paper. Just 3 words in that same handwriting from the rose. For Morelli's daughter. She didn't cry. Not there on the street with strangers walking past. But her eyes burned and her throat closed, and something inside her chest cracked open in a way that hurt and healed at the same time. Clara went back to the restaurant the next day and asked her manager if Luciano had been there. "Not since he came alone that night," he said. "Why?" "No reason." But that wasn't true. She had 1,000 reasons, 1,000 questions. Why would a man like him do something like this? Was it guilt? Redemption? Or just another way to control things? To own things, to make sure everyone knew he had the power to give and take? 2 weeks later, Clara's shift ended at 10. She walked to the employee exit and found an envelope taped to her locker. Inside was a key and a note. "The studio opens next month. It needs someone who understands what it meant. Someone who can teach kids that dancing isn't about perfection. It's about truth. The job is yours if you want it. No strings, no debt. Just a chance to honor what your father built." There was no signature. There didn't need to be. Clara stood there holding the key, and for the first time in 5 years, she let herself imagine a future that looked different than survival. A future that looked like purpose. But one night, someone left a white rose and a note on her locker, and signed, with 3 words that made her heart stop. "Keep dancing, Clara." The Morelli Dance Studio opened on a Tuesday in March. Clara had spent the previous month preparing. The space was perfect, better than her father's original studio, if she was being honest. New floors that didn't creak, mirrors that didn't have cracks, a sound system that actually worked. But she kept the important things. The wooden sign her grandfather had carved, the photos of past students on the wall, the spirit of what the place had been. 20 kids showed up for the first class, ages 6 to 14, some shy, some wild. All of them looking at Clara like she held the answer to something they hadn't figured out how to ask yet. She stood in front of them, wearing dance clothes for the first time in years, and felt her father's presence in the room. Not sad, not haunting, just there, watching, proud. Dancing isn't about being perfect, she told them. It's about being brave enough to tell the truth with your body. It's about saying the things you can't put into words. And trust me, you all have something to say. If this scene touched your heart, hit that subscribe button. I've got more true-to-life stories like this coming. The class started slow. Basic positions, simple movements. But by the end of the hour, all 20 kids were moving like they'd found something they didn't know they'd lost. Clara watched them and felt something she hadn't felt in so long she'd almost forgotten what to call it. Joy. After class, the kids filtered out with their parents. Clara stayed behind to clean up, to sweep the floor, to turn off the lights. She was locking the front door when she saw him. Luciano Vero stood across the street, hands in his pockets, watching. Not hiding, not making a scene, just there. Their eyes met. Clara's first instinct was to go to him, to thank him, to ask him why. But something stopped her. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was wisdom. Some gifts were meant to be received in silence. She nodded once. A simple acknowledgement. He nodded back. Then he turned and walked away, and Clara understood that this was goodbye. Not the angry kind. Not the sad kind. Just the kind where two people who changed each other's lives went back to living them separately. 3 months passed. The studio grew. Word spread. More kids came. Clara hired 2 other teachers. Local dancers who needed work and believed in what the studio represented. They taught ballet, hip-hop, contemporary jazz. The walls filled with laughter and music and the sound of feet hitting floor in rhythm. Clara stopped working at the Silver Monarch, hung up her uniform, said goodbye to the marble floors and crystal chandeliers and people who looked through her instead of at her. She didn't miss it, not even a little, but she thought about that night sometimes. The night she danced out of desperation and discovered power. The night a Mafia boss learned that not everything could be bought or controlled. The night 2 broken people found a way to fix something together without ever really being together at all. One evening, 6 months after the studio opened, Claire was working late, going over budgets, planning the next recital. The kids wanted to perform for the neighborhood, show what they'd learned. Clara thought her father would have loved that. She heard footsteps behind her and turned, expecting one of the other teachers. It was Luciano. He stood in the doorway of the studio, looking older somehow, like the months had worn him down in ways that years hadn't. He didn't come in, just stood at the threshold, like he needed permission to enter a place he'd paid to create. "I heard the kids are doing a recital," he said. "Next month. You're welcome to come. I don't think that's a good idea. People like me, we cast shadows. I don't want to put one over this." Clara walked toward him slowly, stopped a few feet away, close enough to see the exhaustion in his eyes, the weight he carried. "You gave them this," she said softly. "You gave me this. You don't get to hide from the good you've done just because you're scared it doesn't erase the bad. It doesn't erase anything. No, but it matters anyway." They stood in silence. The studio around them was quiet except for the hum of the heater and the distant sound of traffic outside. "Thank you," Clara said. "I never said that. Thank you." Luciano's jaw tightened. For a moment, she thought he might say something, might crack open whatever he kept locked inside. But instead, he just nodded. He turned to leave, and Clara watched his reflection in the mirror. She turned away for just a moment, and when she looked back, he was gone, leaving only his reflection behind. 6 years later, Clara stood in that same studio, watching a teenager named Sophia nail a pirouette she'd been working on for months. The girl's face lit up with pride. Her mother, watching from the corner, had tears in her eyes. This was what the studio had become. Not just a place to learn dance, but a place where kids learned they were capable of more than the world told them they were. Morelli Dance Studio had expanded. They'd taken over the second floor, added more classes, started a scholarship program for kids who couldn't afford lessons. Clara had hired 8 teachers now. The walls were covered in photos of recitals, competitions, and proud kids holding trophies they'd earned through sweat and determination. Never underestimate the quiet ones. Their silence often hides storms strong enough to change the world. But Clara thought about that night often. The night everything changed. She'd tell the story sometimes when students asked how the studio started. She'd leave out names, leave out details that didn't matter. But she'd tell them the important part. Sometimes, she'd say, the world needs you to be small, to be quiet, to stay invisible. And sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is refuse. Dance when they tell you to stay still. Speak when they tell you to shut up. Take up space when they tell you you're taking too much. Because the moment you do that, you give everyone else permission to do the same. The studio had become exactly what her father had dreamed it would be. A place where movement became medicine, where rhythm became resistance, where kids learned that their bodies could be instruments of change. Clara heard things sometimes, through former co-workers, through newspapers, through the whispered gossip that followed powerful men like shadows. Luciano Vero was still out there, still running his empire, still making moves that made prosecutors nervous and journalists careful. But something had changed. His businesses had shifted, more legitimate ventures, community investments. His name started appearing on donation lists for schools and shelters. Never publicly, always through shell companies and anonymous trusts. But Clara knew. People noticed. The streets noticed. His empire didn't crumble. It evolved, became something that did harm in some places and unexpected good in others. Not redemption exactly. More like a man trying to balance scales that could never truly be balanced. Clara never saw him again. Not in person. But every year, on the anniversary of that night, a white rose would appear on the studio's doorstep. No note, no name, just the flower and the memory of what it meant. One evening, 10 years after the dance that changed everything, Clara was teaching an advanced class when one of the students asked her a question. "Miss Clara, were you ever scared to dance in front of people?" Clara smiled, terrified. What made you do it anyway? She thought about that night. The lights, the humiliation, the choice. The moment when being scared mattered less than being true. "I realized something," Clara said. "Fear is just your body's way of telling you something matters. The more scared you are, the more important it probably is. So yeah, I was terrified, but I danced anyway, and it changed my life." The student nodded, processing this. Then she asked, "Do you still get scared?" "Every day. But I dance anyway." The class ended. The students left. Clara walked through the studio, turning off lights, straightening mirrors, preparing for the next day. She paused in front of the wooden sign her grandfather had carved. Morelli Dance Studio. 3 generations of her family had built something here. Something that couldn't be measured in money or power or control. Outside, the city hummed with its endless noise. Millions of people living their lives. Some of them scared, some of them brave, most of them somewhere in between. Clara locked the door, walked out into the night, and headed home. Tomorrow there would be more classes, more kids, more chances to teach them that silence could be powerful and noise could be necessary, and knowing the difference was the real trick. The city never learned Luciano Vero's name in connection with the studio. Never knew that a Mafia boss had funded a place that taught kids to find their voice through movement. That story stayed between 2 people who'd collided for one perfect, terrible, transformative night, and then went their separate ways. But the impact rippled outward. The kids Clara taught went on to teach others. The confidence they found on the dance floor followed them into classrooms and boardrooms and moments when they needed to remember they were strong. That's how change really happens. Not in grand gestures or public declarations, but in quiet moments when someone decides to stop shrinking, when someone chooses courage over comfort, when a shy waitress dances in front of the most dangerous man in New York and reminds him that power comes in forms he'll never control. Clara never regretted that night. Not the humiliation, not the risk, not any of it, because it taught her the most important lesson anyone can learn. You're never as small as the world wants you to believe. And the moment you remember that, you become unstoppable. If this story moved you, share it. Let someone remember that grace is the loudest form of strength. Subscribe for more stories that heal, inspire, and remind us what humanity means. Turn on notifications so you never miss a story, and drop your thoughts in the comments. Your words might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. What moment in your life required courage you didn't know you had? Share it below. Your story could inspire someone to find their own strength. Hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you in the next story.